Hello, I'm Ramon Wrights, and it's a real pleasure to welcome you back to Cine Bijou for our second season. We're also making our Apple Podcast debut. Over the coming months, we'll continue our exploration of independent film with thoughtful features and engaging interviews celebrating the diversity and innovation of the indie film world. Now, if you're new to Cine Bijou, first off, welcome, and I really hope you enjoy the show. You can also visit all our previous episodes on the following platforms: Spotify, Podbean, and YouTube. And should you wish to support our work, you can become a member on Patreon. Your contribution, however modest, helps us to spotlight voices and stories that might otherwise go unheard. So wherever you are, grab your popcorn and settle in as we present today's feature, a closer look at the filmmakers, narratives, and techniques shaping the future of storytelling. Yes everyone, we're back for a second season, and today we're celebrating a wild, action-packed milestone, the 10th anniversary of the UK release of Electric Boogaloo, the wild, untold story of Cannon Films, the explosive documentary written and directed by Australian filmmaker Mark Hartley. Let's have a quick look at the trailer, shall we? Oh, and if you're listening on Podbean and Apple Podcasts, a link to the trailer is included in the show notes below.
Our agent Marty Baum said, look, if you guys want to just go make a film and be totally left alone, there are two new guys in town.
Menachem Golan and Yoram Globus were the heavyweights. They were the George Foremans and the Muhammad Alis of the indie market.
Yoram Globus was the businessman behind the movie making.
Where is my money? You promise and promise and promise and you're not paying.
Menachem Golan was the movie maker.
He redubbed me with an American voice, but not a voice similar to mine.
A true ninja doesn't kill. He eliminates, and only for defensive purposes.
He's so not ninja.
I don't know, I've never seen a ninja.
Ninja 3: The Domination managed to take The Exorcist, a ninja movie, and combine it with Flashdance.
Nuts, just crazy nuts.
Sometimes we make better films, sometimes we don't make such good films, but we do make films.
One of my first questions was, how much money do you think you'll be spending on it? And they said, oh, probably $10 million. I think they ended up spending about $3.75 on it.
The name of the game is to do, not just to blah, 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 blah. Talk about it.
This year, the big hit for Golan and Globus is Breakin'.
It really did something the United Nations was unable to do so far. Bring nations together under one groove.
Really? I mean, that's insane.
The audience wasn't prepared for the craziness, the looniness. I felt a little stupid doing it.
Clyde the orangutan came to the office. Menachem's deciding whether to sign the orangutan to put him under contract.
It was crazy, talking to a monkey.
This would be an epic of cinema.
Blockbuster of the century.
Oh, God, we are in so much trouble.
And that's why they put a stamp on pop culture.
It's hard to say words Cannon Films without laughing.
At the end of the movie, I had tears in my eyes.
Menachem, he says, aha, I got you.
I was crying because I saw my career going down the toilet and I didn't know what I was going to do next.
I hold them in huge affection, even though they ruined their movie.
This film pulled back the curtain on one of the most outrageous, prolific, and unpredictable movie studios of the 80s, Cannon Films. Headed by Menachem Golan and Yoram Globus, Cannon Films shook the pillars of the world film industry. From ninja flicks to breakdancing sequels and Chuck Norris epics, those go-go boys redefined the independent spirit for a new generation. To mark this special occasion, I'm joined by two very special guests. Firstly, we have reviewer and filmmaker Oliver Harper. Oliver is known for his deep dives into cinema and retrospective film analysis with his YouTube channel and his work on films In Search of the Last Action Heroes, Here Comes a New Challenger, and the upcoming Untold stories of No Retreat, No Surrender. And our second guest is the definitive voice on all things Cannon, author of the 3-volume epic The Cannon Film Guide, Austin Trunick. Buckle up, folks, because we're about to revisit the madness, the muscle, and the movie magic of Cannon Films like never before. So what we're talking about, as we've said before, is we're going to talk about Electric Boogaloo, the wild, untold stories of Cannon Films. Although it was initially released 11 years ago, this year marks the 10th anniversary of its UK release. It was released on June the 5th, 2015. And I remember that because it was showing at the Watershed here in Bristol. Oliver's smiling because I think he knows about the Watershed and where it is. And watching it sort of really did take me back to my childhood, where I was big into cinema, big into films, and the realization that a lot of my cinema feasting as a teenager was fed to me by Cannon Films. Some of which I was aware of at the time and some I didn't realize later in life. So what I want to do first of all is, we're all obviously fans. Austin's written the books, the 3 volumes guide to Cannon Films. Oliver, you've interviewed Sam Furstenberg, Sheldon Lettich, we were discussing this earlier, Mark Goldblatt, who's a renowned editor, to name but a few, in search of last action heroes. So what we're going to do is I'm going to start alphabetically with you, Oliver, by surname, to basically get some reflections on the first Cannon film that you saw, whether it was at cinema, VHS, or other home entertainment format. What was the first Cannon film you saw, and how did you then become aware that Cannon Films were actually a thing, if you like, a major player in 80s cinema?
Well, the first Cannon film would have been Superman 4, of all things, you know, because I'm 42 now, so I was being too young to see Superman 4 in the cinema. Well, I would have been like maybe 5 years old, but my parents at that point weren't interested in taking me to the cinema. So I saw it on home video when it came out. In the UK, it doesn't come with the Canon logo at the beginning. It just has the Warner Brothers logo, but on the box it's got the Canon logo there. And also has the classic trailer reels at the beginning of all the Canon/Warner films that were coming out. And in that trailer reel is Masters of the Universe. So that was obviously the next kind of Cannon film I kind of would watch. And it was, because obviously they were the most, I suppose, commercial ones for that period, and obviously for that age range. Because most of their films, as we would find out, are kind of more aimed at adults, generally. Most of them are 18 rated over here. And I didn't really become aware of Cannon as a studio and the quality of their films or their sort of legacy till I got a lot older, because the Cannon films you'd sort of stumble across, maybe down to the fact that I became a bit obsessed with Jean-Claude Van Damme. Then I'd pick up Cyborg, and then Kickboxer was kind of distributed by Cannon, but I don't think it was financed by them, but it was picked up for them. And things like Highlander as well. People get confused thinking Highlander's a Cannon movie. It's like, no, it's a Thorn EMI movie. It's like, Cannon just picked up distribution. So when I sort of looked into Cannon as a studio, I sort of became fascinated by them, because they were sort of pumping out these kind of mediocre movies. It's difficult to know, because obviously if I was a lot older, I would have been kind of aware what was being released by Cannon. I know you sort of found out later on, because my manager, when I worked as a projectionist, worked for Cannon, and he called, obviously everyone, they're always known as the Go-Go Boys, as we both know, and he said, running a Cannon cinema, they'd put their movie in the biggest screen. So, and anyone by Warner Brothers or MGM or Fox will go on a smaller screen. So on release date, Cyborg will be the screen 1, and then screen 2 and 3 might have at least a Weapon 2 or something like that, a Karate 3, but Cyborg will be on the big screen. So I always found that amusing, because it's really, ultimately, Cyborg would have underperformed compared to Lethal Weapon. I think more people would want to see Lethal Weapon. But I just became fascinated with them as a studio, that sort of rise and fall, because that sort of sweet spot. Because I bought your volume 2, Austin, of your book, which is like my favourite part of Cannon, which is basically that mid-80s point, right? So I love that, but they got flush with cash after like Break-In and things like that, and all the junk bonds they got involved with. But it's seeing that kind of rise, them buying all the cinemas in the UK, buying Elstree Studios, and then seeing this kind of spending so much money and not getting enough back in profits, and seeing them kind of crumble, and getting the tax man involved if they're sort of being a bit shady deals behind the scenes. And that's all the juicy stuff. That's the stuff I love. But yeah, as a kid, you just kind of unaware of the studio until you get a little bit older, and you sort of realise the sort of select movies you really enjoy watching, or the genre stuff, is kind of like, oh, that's Cannon. That's a ninja movie. That's an action movie. Oh, that's Cannon. That's Cannon. That's Cannon. And when you get to a certain age, you think, oh, they ruined Superman 4 because of them being cheapskates. I'm like, no! If it was Warner Brothers, it would have been fine. But But you watch that documentary, what was it? The Last Moguls, by Christopher Sykes, when Christopher Reeve rings them up, or like through his agents to have a go at Monarch and Golan for being a cheapskate on Street Smart. It's like, how are you going to make Superman 4? He goes, I'll get the money from the bank. But Chris was smart. He knew they were fucked,
Like Oliver, I was very young through most of Cannon's heyday, and my exposure to them came through the video stores. I grew up in Ohio, a very rural area, so we didn't have a movie theater nearby. I don't remember seeing many movies in theaters when I was a kid, but we went to the video store every weekend. I remember my dad would get out of work. We'd usually go and we'd rent a stack of movies. My sister and I would get one. He'd get a bunch, and we always watched my father's movie first. He was the one, putting the food on our table. We sat down to watch his movies. And my dad was a big Chuck Norris fan. He was a big Charles Bronson fan. All these action movies, and movies I saw probably too young, younger than I would show them to my own children today. But I don't know exactly what the first one would have been. It might have been Invasion USA. That's what I'm guessing, because I remember seeing that a lot as a kid with him. And as I got older and could rent my own movies, these were sort of the same sort of movies you get into as a young teenage boy. If you're going to the theater, you're going to the rental store, you're going to get something with ninjas. You're going to get something with Chuck Norris, Jean-Claude Van Damme. And in the US, a lot of these movies also they were released by MGM on VHS. So they had the bigger boxes. Mm-hmm. So they were very noticeable. You go through the action section, you'd see all the Chuck Norris movies in these bigger boxes, through the Death Wish movies and things like that. And again, the Cannon was king in the video store. You couldn't, I like to say, you couldn't spin around in a circle with your arms out without knocking 5 or 6 Cannon movies off the shelves. So as I got older, I rented a lot of those with my buddies. That would be what we do. We could go to the store after school got out and throw something on the VCR in one of my friend's parents' basements. And that's where, especially Revenge of the Ninja, that was a favorite of mine when I would rent over and over again, because the great box and just being silly fun. It's the perfect movie for that age and having a lenient rental policy at your local store.
Yeah. So I'm going to show my age here by saying that my first foray into Cannon Films was actually early 80s when I was just coming into my teens. And I remember being able to, with the help of a friend's older brother, rent things like Revenge of the Ninja and Enter the Ninja. Although the older brother was also trying to rent Lemon Popsicle at the same time as well. Although that wasn't a Cannon film, but that was a Golan and Globus production, but we didn't see the link between them at the time. And I remember seeing the posters for a lot of the films that I couldn't go to see because I was too young, but seeing them on the cinema billboards. And when Cannon took over the ABC chain, Thorn EMI and the ABC cinemas, we had about 3 or 4 within stone's throw of each other. When they suddenly changed to Cannon, I saw my first Cannon film that I saw in the cinema was Breakdance the Movie, or Break-In as it's called in the US.
Really?
And it was in a Cannon, so it was in a Cannon cinema, and as you said, Oliver, it was in screen 1.
Yeah.
And to be fair, it was packed when we went to see it because they had hit on something at the time. They had caught onto a zeitgeist that was exploded onto the pop culture scene. They exploited it well. They created something that I felt, and this is my general view of Cannon films, I have a sort of fondness for them, for certain films, but I felt that they were always lacking something, and my expectations were never quite met. It was all right, but I expected something more. And that was no exception. But I think that was when I became aware that Cannon was a thing, if you like, and I started to then see the Cannon logos on certain video boxes. Although I used to confuse them with the Guild Home video label sometimes.
Yes, that's
very
true.
very similar logo. But as the Ninja films became popular, I got into those. The American Ninja films came out, and then obviously I was aware of films like Runaway Train. Even as a teenager, I sort of realized, hang on, this is an interesting film. And then as I what came into my late teens, when I become sort of more literate about films, looking at the work of directors, producers, getting involved, getting into the sort of, as you say, the nitty gritty of studio politics and some of the darker side of studio operations, I really became aware that they were mavericks, they were pioneers in some way, but also they were quite shady. And I guess I became aware I was surprised by the exploitative nature of some of their films. The documentary really does shine a light on that, which is they did a lot of sex and violence, especially in the early days. I think towards the later part of their tenure as a big player, they started to move away from that a bit with films like Barfly and Jean-Luc Godard, and the film with John Cassavetes, not Nick Cassavetes, that's his son who was in Face Off. But a bit of obscure info there. So I started to see a sort of a maturity until, as you pointed out, Oliver, they got to films like Superman, which the documentary says they shouldn't have touched. Again, another film I had high expectations for. Yes, I was a teenager. Yes, I went to see it on a date, but I was really anticipating something great, and I came away thinking a little bit underwhelmed. But it's a film that I've watched over 100 times nonetheless, because I think that sums up Cannon, this sort of love-hate relationship that we all seem to have.
Yeah, you can see, like, the quality is kind of, the idea is kind of interesting, and the passion's behind it, but just don't have the money. And it's always, like, as we saw with, like, Over the Top and breakdancing, and these kind of, they capture these little moments in time, which they kind of jump on these trends where they don't really take off. Especially with Over the Top, everyone thought arm wrestling, it was going to be really interesting, but it wasn't at all. It didn't take off. And it's, as you say, like with, like, you was disappointed as a teenager, kind of seeing some of these films not being fully satisfied, and that is always the thing, isn't it? It kind of wins you over with the poster, because their posters, as we both know, like, they always sold everything on a poster. The posters are always awesome when you see them. I want that on my wall, and but the poster doesn't really represent the quality of the movie. And they're great at advertising, weren't they? That was the thing.
That was part of their whole sales process, the pre-sales. They would make these posters spectacular looking artwork and sell that, and that would be how they'd finance the movies, by selling them ahead of time. And they arguably did that as well as anybody back then. They, as you're alluding to, the posters and the advertising looks much more exciting than the ultimate final product usually resulted in.
Yeah, that's true. And I think I probably sound a bit disingenuous when I talk about my expectations with Cannon Films, but I suppose that's true of any film, really. There's been plenty of big budget films that were made by Warner's, Fox, that we all had high hopes for and came away feeling a bit let down. But I think there was a lot of vision in Cannon Films. I thought their vision for the American Ninja films, to create that, I thought actually that was their way of saying, okay, we kind of did okay with the first trilogy. Obviously, Revenge of the Ninja, I don't know how you guys feel, but I think it's the better of the first three trilogies. It's because it's Sho Kosugi front and center, not just as the choreographer working with the late Steve Lambert, but as the star of the film. He had charisma, he had likability, and of course, he kicked ass like nobody's business. But he was sidelined in Enter the Ninja, and then sidelined again in Ninja 3. And that was a pattern that Cannon Films repeated with a lot of its potential stars. Build them up for a little bit and then sideline them. But I think with American Ninja, even with Blood Hunt number 3 and Annihilation number 4, I think they kind of did the series and the stars a bit more justice, if you like, in giving them something quite meaty and enjoyable. So general reflection then on Cannon Films. Let's see how do they compare now to when you first discovered Cannon Films? Is there any films that sort of hold a place in your heart? Any favorites? And are there any that have kind of aged poorly that you don't like to, you don't have to admit to it on here if there's a title you don't want to be associated with, but any that have aged poorly, any that you feel are timeless and that hold a special place in your hearts?
I think Life Force is probably my favourite Cannon film. I think that kind of still works really well. There's some of it you probably couldn't get away with today. With a big budget movie, woman just walking around completely naked, you know. But I thought there's such a great combination of different types of genre of film just slammed into one. And no one, if someone said to you, "Oh, it's about these aliens and they turn you into zombies and they're vampires," you'd be like, "Oh, I've got to watch this." You know, it's a great kind of concept and it's executed really well. And that's when, you know, Cannon had loads of money to throw at people and let Toby Hooper do what he wanted. And I still have a lot of appreciation for Masters of the Universe. I think that was kind of, but maybe their most expensive film, perhaps. Maybe that between that and Life Force. I think the visual effects still kind of hold up in places due to Boss Film and their 65mm effects work in that. It's got a brilliant score. And it was weirdly, I always thought Cobra was a Cannon film, and that's kind of one thing that doesn't get mentioned in Electric Boogaloo. No, they don't cover Cobra, and I think I do so much digging. Then I was going through your book, Austin, and I was like looking at the sort of the history of Cobra, and it's a Warner Brothers film that kind of, I think, to get Stallone out of his contract with Cannon was to sort of sideline it and to do Cobra. And so that's another big movie. That was a huge movie, and even though it's got Menachem Golan and Yoram Globus' name on it, they have barely anything to do with that film.
Cobra was actually a film that surprised me. I thought it was just a straight violent shoot 'em up R-rated action film.
Yeah.
But I was surprised by the humor in it and the chemistry between Rene Santoni and Sylvester Stallone. I love the way they played off each other, and even Bridget Nielsen I thought was quite watchable in that. And you know, again, the chemistry between, I mean, we knew by then that they were married, but still it worked well, and the action was great, and the villains were actually, you know, led by Brian Thompson, who just seemed to always spend his life playing a villain. I thought that was probably the breakout surprise Cannon film for me, was Cobra, and it is one I go back to and watch regularly. What about you, Austin?
Yeah, I feel like Cannon kind of went through these forgotten, almost dark period for a little while after the video store heyday, after the company closed. A lot of these movies took a long time to come out on DVD, or they had small pressings. You didn't have the online streamings. You didn't have a place like Tubi where you could see a lot of these films.
Yeah.
And for 20 years, really, until you get to the early 2010s, I would say, you kind of people forgot about Cannon. You'd see the big titles. You know, they could sell the T-shirts with the logo on it on some online websites, but people weren't really talking about them. And then you have this documentary come out. You have great communities online coming, whether it's on YouTube or in podcasts or in forums where people can talk about these movies. And then a lot of them becoming available on streaming and Blu-ray again. So over the last 10 years, really, we had this great sort of attention being paid to this renaissance, people coming back and putting this company together, drawing the, you know, connecting the dots between this film, this film, this is the company that made Life Force, this is the company that made Love Streams, this is Death Wish 2, this is the company that made King Lear. And people have put this together, and I think that's fantastic. There was a long time where people weren't able to draw these bigger pictures, and now we are able to do that, and we're able to find people who also want to discuss these movies. You can find people talking about these movies, and that's wonderful. Again, there were 20 years of a dark period where if I wanted to talk to somebody, or if I wanted to see Revenge of the Ninja, I had to have an X-rental tape that I found on eBay, and I do love that. I'm sorry, that's strayed way off your question, but
no,
I think it's really interesting, Austin, because the documentary by Mark Hartley kind of really sort of revitalized interest in Cannon. And beforehand, because you'd only see what was easily accessible out of Cannon were kind of their most recognizable IP, was He-Man and Superman, the Cobra, over the top. Had big names, big stars in it, but everything else in between kind of fell through the cracks, and they wouldn't be. MGM would maybe sort of re-release some stuff on DVD, so I think maybe some point it was like print on demand stuff. So a lot of it's kind of lost, and if you had to find these movies you loved when you were younger, or you have a brief memory of, think, oh, I have to go find the old VHS, or if you had the money, you can get a Laserdisc. But Canon didn't do that. The Canon weren't great with their Laserdiscs. I bought a few and they're a bit crap quality. But things like the Chuck Norris films, you could probably, they probably would re-release. But after that sort of wave of the documentary and everyone sort of recognised Canon again, you'd see the studios kind of pump these movies out, and then we start seeing all the boutique labels kind of re-release the movies, very select ones, of course, because there was a lot of Canon films that are crap. But because obviously, Austin, you've gone through all of them, so you've got, oh God, I'm going to fast forward this, So, but there's some, but there is a lot of hidden gems in there, and that's kind of the thing where I think really thanks to the advent of DVD has kind of given Canon a new lease of life,
You mentioned, there are a lot of the bad movies, and in my position where I am, going through all of them and watching them over and over again to write these chapters on each. There's a bit of a Stockholm syndrome, where I'll find something to love about a movie.
Oh, sure.
But again, it's also something I love about Canon is the stories behind the movies are usually good, even if the movies are really not.
Exactly.
It can make me fall in love with something like Bolero, which is a movie that, if I have to watch it again, I'll. But it's got a great story. It was great to write about. Putting the backstory. Researching that and putting these together is just a wonderful. The subject matter couldn't be better.
But that's the beauty of Cannon Films. It's the stuff behind the scenes which is so fascinating. That's what makes the studio so interesting. Because ultimately, when you see a documentary about Warner Brothers, I'm like, man, I'm not fussed about that. But it's Cannon Films, or if it was someone like Orion Pictures, I'm like, I want to know about them. You know what I mean? Those sort of the smaller labels, the independent kind of companies, that were kind of more fascinating because they took more risks and. I think a bit more fun with the sort of movies they put out. And that was the thing I appreciated about Canon in my later years, was that they gave these directors who didn't get a chance on the big studios, they gave them a chance. And we see like them take a risk on different types of movies. I think it was a gamble to see what didn't work. Let's make the next movie and see if that works. That's what I love about them.
Yeah, they loved the very young directors, people who wanting to get out there and cut their teeth on a movie. And they also went to the guys who weren't able to get films financed. You got John Frankenheimer making movies out of rehab. That's just stuff like that. These older gentlemen who weren't able to make movies or weren't able to write, especially in the screenwriting side. You have a lot of 70-year-old screenwriters writing Charles Bronson movies in the 80s. And it's something that's great that they also gave both young and the very old the chance to kind of get back into the game.
But what's interesting, I mentioned about my relationship with Canon being a little bit of a love-hate sort of dynamic, but I think there was one with filmmakers and writers too. I mean, so looking at the documentary, they featured David Eichenberg, who wrote Death Wish 2, Over the Top, and he said they treated him horribly, that they took his work and they rewrote it into something that he considered was awful. And there were other sort of filmmakers and writers in there that said much the same thing. Stephen Tolkien said that they didn't fully appreciate, that Golan and Globus didn't fully appreciate the effort it took to produce these things, and that you put so much heart and soul and passion for it that they just seem to sort of appreciate it only in the abstract. Yet you do have Frank Zeffirelli and John Frankenheimer and the late Robert Forster, who absolutely fantastic actor, even in the Delta Force, which is the one Cannon film I truly dislike.
Delta Force, you don't like the first one?
The first one, yeah. Love the second one, yeah. Love the second one. I find it quite offensive, actually, but that's just me.
I think people did at the time as well.
Yeah, but he was great in it as the villain, but even he said, this is one of the most hardest working filmmakers I've ever worked with. He's a great director and a salesman. And yeah, you've got that love-hate dynamic within the people who worked for Cannon, which is interesting. But the documentary, what it did for me is as a kid, I used to, not all the time, but spent a fair amount of time in our local video shop, seeing what's around, looking at all the titles, maybe some of the titles I shouldn't be looking at as a teenager, you know, but always a bit curious, just sort of looking up at the top shelf, and saw all the posters. And I remember seeing posters for films like The Wicked Lady, Mata Hari, Bolero, Schizoid, New Year's Evil, all those exploitative films, as well as Death Wish 3. I remember Barry Norman did a behind the scenes special on Death Wish 3.
He did, didn't he? Yeah.
The London, you know, the filming of, you know, in the London Docklands. I remember that specifically. So when the documentary came out and they mentioned some of those titles, including Lemon Popsicle, which I'd heard about but never seen, because actually skin flicks didn't really interest me much. I was like, oh my God, they did all that? I couldn't believe it. And then when you realize the stories behind them, like Bo Derek's story about how they pinched all their publicity material from their suitcases and were gunning for the Dereks to ruin them over this film, it almost makes me want to go and watch it. However, when Olivia Darbo in that documentary told her story about on set and what she experienced, I thought, no, I can't possibly, you know, stuff.
It's kind of schlocky, exploitative stuff in the early stages, wasn't it? Just to sort of capture, make something cheap and sort of make a profit quickly. And they sort of, in that independent world, that was probably the thing to do. And there's also like with young filmmakers, let's make a horror film because it'll make money. Yeah. A skin flick, it'll make money. And you sort of see them like come to the mid 80s, they sort of clean up their act a bit. You know, because they're working with Warner Brothers and MGM. MGM first, wasn't it, famously? Then MGM was like, "You're delivering us crap movies. We don't want these." You know, Sahara and stuff. You know.
Let's talk about the documentary and the story it tells.
Sure.
I think love-hate is definitely a theme that recurs through that film. But there's enough, even with the hate. When you listen to some of the associate producers, the story readers, editors, and I love the fact that they got those people who were behind the scenes, not just the recognizable names. They do. The general theme is, I have tremendous affection for them, even though they ruined most of my movies. And that's a quote from the documentary. When you first saw it, what kind of story do you felt was being told here? What perceptions of the studio did you get that was sort of changed as a result of watching the film?
I saw it at the I think it was maybe early screening they did in the UK. I think it made part of a film festival in London. And that's where I saw it. But going in, because the trailer they put out wasn't a very long trailer, but I kind of knew what to expect. It's kind of rise and fall of Cannon, a very sort of straightforward story telling the sort of the beginnings of Cannon and their success and so forth. So I kind of knew what to expect. I wanted to see the films I love being covered in detail, and they kind of did that. I mean, it was interesting sort of hearing the stories of House and Ellenshaw, you know, working on Superman and like Dolph. I wanted to see more of Dolph, but he was kind of cut out a little bit. But I had no idea about this sort of early stuff of Cannon. That was kind of fascinating, and how they sort of, you know, we were saying earlier about the exploitative kind of movies, and they sort of found all this kind of wave of success, and this money came piling in, and seeing them sort of, you know, purchase LG Studios and those cinemas, because that was the thing that kind of really fascinated me. There's also things that I was surprised, as you were saying, the sort of the affection they had for Menachem and Urim, but they also were so frustrated with how they were treated, and how, because the money just wasn't there to finish them, they rushed through post-production or whatever, or films that was simple to complete, they just didn't finish. And there was an interesting kind of feedback at the time, because I really enjoyed it for what it was. I love how it was structurally, and it was funny and entertaining. That's the key thing, it's funny, and loads of great kind of stories on behind the scenes. But some of the fans who loved Cannon were really annoyed by it, because they were, you're making fun of these movies we love, and you know, you're taking a piss out of them. I was like, well, you know, you have to remember these films didn't perform well. They were slated when they came out. The filmmakers behind it had a horrible time, but they had, obviously they show the appreciation for the producers, but it was, you had to sort of be realistic in a way, and not be somewhat blindsided by fandom, and realize that they were kind of, in some experience, nasty people who exploited people really badly. But other than the flip side of that, if you're on their Menachem's good side, you can do all right, like Dudikoff. You know?
Yeah, the documentary does a great job of being this lively and upbeat and listening to these stories and listening to these people tell these stories that are just as colorful as the crazy clips you're seeing of, Chuck Norris jumping his rocket launching motorcycle and things like that. You get these wild stories, and it is something that, again, I remember people, especially on like Facebook groups and things around Canon, being like, "Oh, I don't know, like I love these movies. Don't make fun of them." Like, this is a company that a lot of the people in the film, I think, they will admit that they owe their careers to Canon. It may have been, hellfire and brimstone getting through these years. They might have had projects destroyed. They might have fought with the producers, but that got their foot in the door, and they have good memories of that. And again, anytime you have too little money, too little time, and a deadline to release a film, you're going to get great stories on how it was made. And that was something that was Canon's. Every project went like that. And I personally, I was very excited for the documentary. I saw it on a digital screener. I was working as a film section editor for a magazine at the time, so I'd get a lot of movies that I'd watch on my laptop. And I remember looking forward to it because I was kind of putting together these written pieces, very early on what would become my books. And at the time, I didn't know if it would be a blog. I didn't know if it would be a tiny book I was working on. And seeing it come out and seeing all these people talking about Canon again, and the reviews of the film getting covered in magazine stuff, was very gratifying for me, because I felt like, okay, I'm not wasting my time on this project. People are interested in Canon besides myself and, a few online film nerd friends of mine.
Mm-hmm.
So that was a very exciting moment for that to come out and get as much attention as it did.
Mm-hmm. I think one of the stories they told within the documentary that was a surprise for me, shouldn't have been too much of a surprise, but it's probably something I didn't take notice of at the time, was their competitive streak. So when I was into films like Break-In at the time, or Breakdance, the movie as it's called here in UK. I love the fact that in America it's just called Break-In, but here we have to call it by its full, breakdown. We don't do shortening or abbreviations. It's Breakdance the movie, in case you didn't know. I was aware of Break-In. I saw the television spots on Saturday morning television and saw the trailers in the cinemas, and I was also aware of Beat Street that came out at the time. I was big into the hip hop scene as a youngster, so I was really interested in these two films, but I didn't realize that they were in any more competition than, say, any other film. And as somebody who grew up on films in the 80s, sort of more aware of film, should I say, 80s and 90s, it wasn't uncommon to have two kinds of films coming out almost side by side. In the 90s, you had the two Robin Hoods, and then later on you had three Columbus movies. So Carry On Columbus, 1492, and Adventures of Columbus. So it was common practice. So I didn't really think anything of it. So to learn that not only were they aware that other studios were making similar films to theirs, but that they were rushing to get their film out ahead, and they had to absolutely beat all these other films. I thought I was quite impressed by that. I was impressed that they had this competitive streak where they felt not just that they had to put their names on everything that they produced, but to actually be the best at what they do, which is another thing I like. Which is another reason why I liked where they were talking about getting the Oscars for some. Okay, Sahara was never going to win an Oscar, and it's ludicrous to think so. Or any other work, maybe Barfly should have got a nod or two. But I admired the ambition. I thought, well, okay, you're making all these what some people might call bad films, mediocre films, but they had ambition, and that was reflected in their films, their targets, and their acquisition of studios and film libraries and cinemas. They really wanted to be something big, and I came away with a bit more admiration than I already had, as well as some fondness for that. But
you're definitely spot on, because I think they had, I think there's sort of, they just kind of rushed, didn't they? They just had no patience. Sort of, if you just let things go a little bit more slowly, then I think they would have hanged around for a lot longer. And that was it, wasn't it? By 85, 86, 87, they were pumping out, 50 movies a year or something stupid, wasn't it? You can look at the let's look at the credits of Menachem for that 86. It's like out of control.
Yeah, it's incredible the amount they achieved. 86 is the perfect year to look at, because you put out 40 movies of your own that you produced in-house, plus your pickups, plus your one of your two leaders has directed 2 movies in that time, and you also bought Thorny MI and Osprey Studios, and any company, if they achieved 5% of that would be a great year. But with Cannon, it was just go all the time, and again, it leads to some incredibly wild stories.
Absolutely. I have to admit, I love the story in the documentary about Bridge Over Brooklyn with Elliot Gould and Margot Hemingway, which I think Menachem Golan directed. I've never seen the film, and it's not one that interests me. Like I said, but I have to admit, based off what the stories Elliot Gould was talking about, his clashes with Menachem, I have to now go and watch that film to see if the direction he gave him actually worked. Even though people were laughing when they told the story about the direction, they were laughing about it and saying, "Oh, this is ridiculous." So I'd like to see if it actually worked. But more than anything, it has got me curious about some of their more, I don't want to say meaningful, but some of their more sort of attempts at deeper filmmaking. So they wanted to tell a nice sort of meaningful love story there that people could resonate with. So it's made me want to go back to that. I love that story though, when he says, and I called him a cocksucker, and then he shut down production, and then I had to go and say, "No, you're not a cocksucker." And
the best story I always loved was when there's guys outside with Uzis, and he goes, "Tell them to go fuck themselves," or when like the poltergeist score. We want the poltergeist score. We get 50 musicians, get to play it twice. It's so good. Those little stories.
Yeah, it kind of goes back to what again I mentioned Stephen Tolkien, because I think he sums up Golan and Globus perfectly in that they're passionate about film, they're passionate about cinema, but they only have a surface level. Even Menachem as a director, they kind of have a surface level understanding and appreciation. They think it's just, like you said, you told that story about the orchestra, just get a 50-piece orchestra and get them to play it twice. I mean, we don't know the context of that, and I suspect he was probably being a bit snarky, but saying that, if that's serious, then that's them not fully appreciating actually what the implications are, that if you want that kind of impact, you're going to have to spend money getting the right resources in place.
Yeah, I think it's always down to quality control. That was it. They didn't have that. And also there's, with terms of like, as we sort of mentioned with what they saw a market for something, it's that weird kind of culture clash, isn't it? These kind of guys from Israel trying to make American movies, and it's always doesn't quite, it's like Hong Kong trying to make an American movie. It's always a weird thing where you've got the elements in place, but I think that some of the humor is a bit weird, or tonally it's a bit off, and that's when an American audience will be like, "That's a bit weird," or it doesn't quite gel. And that was it. That was a lot kind of run throughout a lot of these kind of Cannon films, and to the point where the more commercial kind of bigger name movies don't really kind of have that, because they've got because they have less interest in it. They've just bought, like Masters. They've only Master Universe. They've only bought it off Mattel, and then let these Gary Goddard and whatever do what they want, essentially within that sort of restriction of budget. But they don't really. Half the time they never knew what they were making, were they? So they just kind of sat there and watched the movie and got confused, didn't they, about what Invaders from Mars and what was it, the sequel to something else, So
it was the Alan Quatermain film, Alan Quatermain and the Lost City of Gold.
That's right, yeah.
And again, showing how many times I've seen the documentary. I think it was Gary Nelson was telling the story where he says Menachem's there watching this Alan Quatermain film, saying, "Look at the queens, they're supposed to be ugly. Why are they so beautiful?" And he confused it with Toby Hooper's Invaders from Mars.
Yeah. It's mad, isn't it? I think that's the problem. The things got out of control, and they just weren't paying attention to what was being made.
And they worked under tight deadlines as well.
Yeah.
With the way they sold things, they would give the companies would sign, the distributors would sign up for the film based on the poster that hadn't been made yet, and Cannon would give them a delivery date. So once they'd sold enough at the Cannes Film Festival, sold enough distribution for one film, they would have the 16 weeks or whatever till the delivery date to actually write, cast, shoot, edit, and release that film. And usually that time, anytime they lost time, it always came at the end during the post-production phase, because they had to meet those deadlines or pay fines in their contracts. So quality control was something that they were probably the people who they got to see the movie right before they went to like strike the prints and didn't have time to make fixes.
Yeah, it's like a big film factory, but all inside are very cheap parts, and it's all just getting pumped out really quickly. It's like in Santa Claus the movie, where he's made that machine, it's firing out all those toys really quickly, everything's falling apart inside. You know, it's a bit, that's kind of what I sort of think about it, you know.
But one of the things that's come out of the documentary, a sort of a reappreciation for, is, okay, on the one hand, they didn't invest in some of their sort of rising stars. They didn't, I mean, Michael Dudikoff did well out of Cannon in that he was kept busy. But then after Cannon, after the Golan and Globus went their separate ways and Cannon essentially folded, if you like, Dudikoff's career tended, kind of sort of went off kilter, and I think so did Chuck Norris's a little bit in a way. I think really for Chuck Norris, his saving grace was Walker, Texas Ranger.
That's correct.
Because that was just as Cannon was sort of winding down. Walker, Texas Ranger came out and continued to keep him in the limelight. For Chuck Norris, Jean-Claude Van Damme, Charles Bronson, they really elevated their careers. I mean, Charles Bronson, okay, he told Lance Hall he didn't want to do Death Wish 3, 4, and 5, but he also did Kinjite, Forbidden Subject, which was a mildly good film, actually. It was a bit of a revenge flick, but there was all these sorts of interesting cultural dilemmas in that, which I thought was quite interesting, albeit touched on briefly. And then you had Assassination with his wife Jill Ireland, where he's the Secret Service agent protecting the First Lady, which I thought actually was a nice, nifty little thriller that gave him something different to do other than be an avenging vigilante packing heat. So it did some good in a way, though, didn't it? And I think that comes across in the documentary.
Cannon did things backwards when it came with their sequels. Usually, if you're a film studio, if you make another movie, each one's going to get bigger and you're going to spend more on the next one to top the one that came before. Cannon went backwards with any of their series. The American Ninja movies got progressively cheaper. The Ninja movies got progressively cheaper. Death Wish, they spent less on each one. And rather than spending more, which would be what you need to do to kind of keep building up those careers, Cannon would just try to squeeze more liquid out of that stone each time. And it was, again, like Oliver mentioned, that they had a very different way of doing things. Things were lost in translation. I think doing that with lemon popsicle movies, where you can just keep making the same thing, spending less, and you kind of have this audience that's built in for it, it doesn't work when you're trying to build an action franchise or build an action star. And yeah, they did wind down a lot of careers that could have been even bigger. You feel like Dudikoff could have been even bigger had they spent more on him. But Chuck Norris, you mentioned Walker, which I love, something I'm writing about in a third book now, but Cannon Television actually produced the early Walker, the first opening movie and the first, I think, 7 episodes.
Really?
And they did, and they lost.
Wow.
They lost the money to finish the season, and they ended up selling it out. So, Cannon, had they, been able to spend some money there at the end, they might have been in charge of Walker the whole way. But
it's kind of like, wasn't it, with Death Warrant? I think with the Van Damme film, I think that was going to initially developed by Cannon, then MGM, I think, had picked it up to sort of finish it. There was a kind of thing going around, like the other studios didn't like Cannon, and they wanted to see them fail and crumble, and I think that was the time around that sort of 87 period, because obviously the maybe 86 time or 87, the Wall Street kind of crash of everything dipped and Cannon was screwed because all their money was in junk bonds, and with the whole Superman 4 fiasco, there was like, well, Warner Brothers could have stepped in and finished it and polished it off, but they didn't. They wanted to cut everything out and then release it. And just basically, they knew Cannon would be in trouble anyway if this film was going to fail. So it's more losses for them. So there was this kind of behind the scenes hoping they'd basically just disappear. And things would go south for them. But yeah, it was. I mean, that's never really confirmed. There's always people I've spoken to have gone, yeah, they wanted to see them fail.
It's a lot of cases too. Cannon just had a lot of balls in the air, but they were juggling at once. And if they stopped a movie or put more time into it, that meant they wouldn't deliver that movie, and then they wouldn't have money that had to go into paying all these other people on these films that are currently shooting. So it was just again, so much happening at once that eventually you're going to miss and everything's going to hit the ground.
Exactly.
So one of the big surprises for me in the documentary, I hadn't heard anything about this, was at the end when the credits come up and it announces that they had approached Menachem and Yoram to participate in the film, because I was wondering, why aren't they in this? Or have they died or retired and don't want to? And of course, it said they were invited to participate and they declined, and then went ahead and made their own film, The Go-Go Boys, which was released 3 months earlier. I mean, you couldn't get more canon than that, really, could you? No, we don't like your film. We're going to make our own, and we're going to get it out there, and it's going to be better. It's going to be better than Mark Hartley. It's going to be better than anything. And it reminds me of the theme of the documentary. Everybody, Catherine Mary Stewart said, said Menachem felt he was better than Ken Russell, and better than everybody.
And there's 2 Lombarda movies, wasn't it? That was it.
Oh well, yes, and he was going to beat Yoram's Lombarda film. So have you guys seen the Go-Go Boys at all?
Yeah, I saw it when it got announced. It was quite difficult to get hold of. I think it was kind of like later on they'd released it, and because it was obviously in French, I think it was, wasn't it? I had to wait for it to find a copy with subtitles on, and I didn't particularly like it. I think it was a very kind of cheap, kind of rushed thing. It very much relied a lot on archive stuff, which was fine because some of it I hadn't seen, this archive material. It had different talking heads, which was nice. It had Van Damme in it and Michael Dudikoff and things like that, which was cool to see. But on an entertainment level, it just didn't really match. And it was obviously they shared similar things where they both felt Superman could have saved the studio if they'd spent the money, but most of it was. It kind of felt like a slapdash kind of afterthought. So as I said, to compete with Electric Boogaloo, which was had the backing of a big studio and Brett Ratner involved to sort of help with clearing a lot of the clips and fair use stuff. But I think in presentation level, it just didn't lack. It would lack the Go-Go Boys kind of lacked the polish of Electric Boogaloo.
Yeah, I tell people that they should watch both. I think the Go-Go Boys has some great archival materials. They have the access. Having Menachem and Yoram in there is wonderful. And I do love how you get a little bit... Electric Boogaloo focuses, of course, on the Cannon years the most, but you get in the Go-Go Boys, you get more of their time in Israel and leading up to coming, which I think is great. I would say watch Electric Boogaloo first. but Go-Go Boys is absolutely worth seeking out. And again, getting Van Damme in there and getting some of the access to people that weren't in Electric Boogaloo, I think it makes them a nice pair. And nowadays with streaming and being able to rent things online, it's easy to make that a double feature if you want.
Yeah, good point, Austin.
Looking back on Electric Boogaloo then, do you think it was a fair summation of the studio from everything we know and read and from what you've researched, Austin? And is there anything they should have included that they didn't?
I love the documentary. I love Electric Boogaloo. I think everything Mark's done before and since then, I've become a fan of his. I think it is impossible to cover everything with Cannon. I've got the 2 books. The first 2 books are about 1,800 pages.
Yeah, they're big.
That's a drop in the bucket. There's so much stuff I can't cover, so I can't imagine how hard it was to squeeze all the stories they got and to cut it down into the documentary. And I think as a summary of Cannon, it's excellent, and I love that you can find on a lot of physical media releases now that are related to these films extended clips from it, extended interviews.
Yeah.
The release of Masters that just came out in Australia and Umbrella had some great Rapune interviews in there and things like that. And I am just so grateful that that documentary was made and a lot of those interviews were done when they were, because it's something I'm reaching in now even more as 10 years have passed. We're losing a lot of these people. A lot of these actors, a lot of these directors, a lot of these people have passed in that time. People that I interviewed in the books, people that I wanted to interview and had passed away before it could happen. Any type of scholarship, anybody who's doing it, whether it's Oliver's documentaries and so many wonderful books that are coming out that people are putting out, people that are taking 80s B movies, 80s independent movies, cheap 80s movies, and doing this sort of level of scholarship and approaching them as a historian. I am extremely grateful, because those films weren't taken very seriously when they first came out, and now's finally their chance. And for a lot of these, we're getting towards our last chances to really appreciate this era of film that, maybe someday down the road there'll be as many books about Vietnam 80s Vietnam action films as there are about film noir movies now. I doubt that, but I hope people look at these movies and realize they are worth preserving, and the stories behind them are worth preserving.
Yeah, Austin made a good point there about sort of the timing of these things and interviewing them before they sort of pass away, and they trying to get things done quicker rather than later, and that's the thing where it's a shame that these sort of movies are only getting kind of recognized or appreciated now, instead of like at the time, or maybe a little bit earlier. So we had that opportunity to sort of revisit these actors and directors and writers at an earlier stage, where now the younger people who appreciated them are only fully now sort of want to sink their teeth into these films and find out more, and it's also a little bit too late for that. But it's good that Mark Hartley had done it at the time, and I think that maybe that sort of wave of popularity of 80s pop culture, where now we're sort of seeing a trend more to 90s now, sort of shifting as that generation are getting older and they get nostalgic for the 90s. So it was good it came out around that time and got those people, and I think it really did a good job of sort of showing you who Cannon were, the stuff they put out, and being somewhat kind of balanced in an opinion about the sort of pros and cons. There may be sort of a bit more on the negative side, but I think the negative side kind of played with quite a lot of humour, and it was never like, nothing's ever delivered in a horrible fashion, make you go, oh, I don't feel comfortable. You always feel comfortable throughout the entire documentary because you're just laughing your ass off, or just finding it so ludicrous they do these things, and it was just a great love letter. That was honest, I think, from Mark's side, and as Austin, written these massive books, there's so many films they'd left out, and you can't cover all of them in a theatrical runtime, and you have to that's the problem I had with the action documentary I made. People are like, you missed this film, that film. It's like, well, you have to sort of cut your darlings, as it were, and focus on films that people will really know about, and they know about Death Wish, they know about Master Universe, they know about Over the Top, Cobra, and things like that. So you want to dedicate your time. Well, actually, Cobra's not in it, but as we discussed earlier, but those kind of
not a sore point for you then, Oliver.
No, not really. It's just like, just realised it wasn't a Cannon film, but it was. Yeah, you have to sort of pick the movies that are going to help tell the story. That's the thing.
See, I think the summation is absolutely spot on, an honest, heartfelt love letter. Because it doesn't do the studio down. It focuses on key events that's part of the Cannon story, whilst showcasing the best and the worst of its work, to explain how they rose to fame or infamy, and to their eventual downfall. And I think everybody is interested in a rise and fall story, and then wonder, well, where did everybody go from there? And then that's another story, I suppose.
Yeah.
So I think it's fair to say that Cannon Films holds a big place in our hearts, and there'll be many more discussions and books to be written, maybe, Austin, and films to be made, Oliver, and many more podcasts, series, and features. But
what would you say, lads, are your top 5 Cannon films before we go? What do you think?
Austin?
That's tough. Yeah, somebody. I do have a list though. If somebody were press a gun to my head and choose, Revenge of the Ninja is probably my all-time favorite since my youth. I love Invasion USA. Those are both ones that I grew up on watching over and over again. Ones that I love that I've discovered in the process of working on this book. The Apple is a movie that is just unique. It needs to be seen to be believed. You know, the sci-fi biblical musical set in the far future of 1994. Just it's magic, and it's a movie I did not know about until I started really looking into Cannon seriously. Tough Guys Don't Dance is another one in that same area, and I guess I have to say Bloodsport. Bloodsport is just the perfect martial arts movie, in my opinion. You've got Enter the Dragon, you've got Bloodsport, and those are my 2 favorite of that whole genre. So if I had to choose 5, those are my 5.
So, okay, I'll keep mine short. There's a guilty pleasure in there. I know you're all going to groan when you hear it, but I'll get that one out of the way. Over the Top actually is one of my favorites. And I think it's because of the soundtrack. I think the soundtrack is absolutely ace on that. And so Over the Top. Superman 4. Yes, I know it didn't meet my expectations, and there's a lot of horror stories around that. But by the way, Austin, if you haven't seen Oliver's documentary, Superman 4, Tale of Glass and Steel, I think that's what it's called. Do check it out. But there's something quite I like about that, and I think it's because of it's Christopher Reeve and late Gene Hackman and John Cryer and Margot Kidder. They all make that film. So Over the Top, Superman 4, Masters of the Universe, Life Force, and yes, definitely Bloodsport. Bloodsport is actually a timeless. I'm gonna put in an honourable mention to the film you've got a poster for there, Austin, Runaway Train, because I agree with the sentiment in the documentary. Had it not been a Cannon film or had the Cannon logo on it, it would be considered an absolute classic. So, and I think it is. So,
I mean, it would be Ninja 3 Domination because it's so bonkers. Love it. Death Wish 3 because it's so silly as well. I love films that are completely over the top and bonkers. Next will probably be Masters of the Universe, Bloodsport, then Life Force. I think number 1 is Life Force for me. Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2 is pretty good because it's this like let's just go nuts with it, you know. And that's what sort of that was their kind of Cannon's sort of like +1 or something, you know, you get like because it's gone a little bit crazy, and that's what I like.
Well, that's it for this episode of Cine Bijou. Thanks for joining us as we pulled open the curtain once more, revealing the world of independent film and the creative mavericks who make it all happen. You can find this and every other episode on Spotify, Podbean, YouTube, and of course, Apple Podcasts. And if you enjoyed this episode, why not leave a star review or drop us a comment? It's a small gesture, sure, but it means the world to us, and it helps fellow film fans find their way to us too. Make sure you also follow us on all the usual social media haunts: Instagram, Facebook, Threads, and Blue Sky. And for reviews, features and more, why not pay us a visit at our website www.cine-bijou.co.uk. And if you are spreading the word, please don't forget to use the hashtag SupportIndieFilm, because every share helps keep great stories in the spotlight. Until next time, keep listening, keep discovering, and as ever, let's keep that indie flame burning.